I wanted to take a look at the idea of slip stitch color work. These two samples here are both from Knitting with Rainbows, which uses a variety of ways of combining gradient yarn, and for colors that come in sets with multiples of different colors like this, slip stitch patterns are ideal. So for slip stitch pattern work, it looks as though there's two colors worked in a row, but in fact you're never working more than one color at a time because the other color is slipped. Now that actually allows you to create a huge variety of effects, because in this case you can see the pattern that is still being worked along here is garter stitch, but there was some stockinette stitch in between, and these are the one that is slipped. So it creates almost a brick-like effect because this is a slip stitch of that original color pulled over. And so it looks like it's breaking it up, but in fact it's just slipping those stitches. Big advantage being that you can create much more complex and interesting textures while only ever working one strand of color at a time. Now if you worked in the round, you've got a bit more variety of ways of working it available to you. If you're working flat, you'll always work two rows of each color. So you'll work the color all the way to the end, and then you'll work back on the wrong side row. There's another variation on slip stitch color work that's known as Mosaic color work, and that's usually done with where it's in garter stitch, and it's the same idea, but the actual color work becomes a little bit more complex and is quite pictorial and creates little shapes and things like that. And the garter stitch compresses it vertically, so you can get quite a lot of detail into the work as you're going. This shawl here, let me open it up, is slight variations on a few different slip stitch color work patterns again here. And it gives you, and it shows you some of the things that you can actually do. You can see I've got all these lines and dots, and I've got things lifted over. That is one thing that a slip stitch will allow you to do, because if you're working along and you're slipping some stitches, when you lift them over, you can cross over in a different color. So it means that you can sometimes combine colors together in rows like this, and giving a texture with slip stitches and yarn overs and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting effects that can be done with slip stitches. So I've just got a tiny little sample here to show you kind of what I mean. When you're doing slip stitches, if you're doing it in from a chart, there's going to, as I was saying, every row is, there's going to be two rows in each color. If you see the color up here that was from the last one, you know that's not the color you're supposed to be working. You need to switch back over to the other one, because you're not going to work 4 rows in the same color. So I know based on this that I'm going to go get started working on this one here. And on a chart as well, any colors that are slipped are going to show the original color but with a slip mark. And that's because you're slipping from a different color row down here. When you slip it, it's going to pull that other color up over it. So let's just go play around a little bit here now. I'm going to go just knit down over as far as here, and then I'll slip this one, but knit the next one over. And then I'll knit to this one, and when you slip, you see as well, I'm slipping it purlwise. And it's okay when it's one, but when it gets bigger, a bit like with stranded color work, when you begin working over here, stretch it a little bit, because if you start pulling it very tightly, it'll pucker. If it's too loose, you can end up with loose stitches. So that is something that you learn with practice, that it just gets a little bit more comfortable too. I'll slip this one. I'm not following a pattern, just experimenting here. But yeah, you get used to the actual tension you need to keep. So when you finish that row and you turn around, you can either follow the chart, or what I find quite straightforward as well is it's color coded, that anything that is in a different color was slipped in the last row, and you know it's going to be slipped again here. This time it's a wrong side row, and what a wrong side row means is you still want to keep all of your strands on this side, so you're going to have to make sure, like it's fine when you're doing like I'm doing a purl row here, but if it's a knit row, you'll have to bring the yarn over. I'll show you what I mean here. I'll kind of vary between purl and knit so you can see. So if I'm working purl as far as here, and I encounter this one, I can leave the yarn on this side, because when I slip it and start working the next row, my strand stays on the wrong side, which is the one facing me. Now I'm just going to swap over and pretend I'm working in garter stitch, so it means it's knit, and then I encounter my stitch in a different color, but my yarn is on the front, so I don't want that there. When I slip the stitch, I'll bring that yarn back, slip the stitch, and then bring that back over again so that I can knit the next row. So that's really, really important, is remembering where your strands are going to be, because otherwise what will end up happening is these strands that pass across here, if you're doing your garter stitch, you don't bring it back, you'll have that line going across the front here. Now, in your pattern, it may actually specify that. They may have lines of the other colouring running through for the pattern. So, take a look and make sure that you know what the pattern intends. And you can see as well how if you've got, this is kind of a little bit similar to this here, when you change to garter stitch, but these ones are slipped, it adds this variety of texture where this is a nice smooth stockinette stitch, but then the other stitches have got these garter bumps, and it's actually really interesting. It gives a lot more contrast. So slip stitch color work is a really, really nice way of stepping into using colors without having to yet learn the technique of how to do stranded color work.